Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing study of the United States and the Cold War. In the previous lectures, we've traced the rivalry between the United States and Russians back centuries prior to the outbreak of what we know as the Cold War in the aftermath of World War II. Now it's time to address the question that I've mentioned several times already. How was it that wartime allies quickly became rivals in the aftermath of World War II? In this lecture, we'll talk primarily about a war of words that broke out shortly after the war ended. Both sides had opportunities to downplay and calm down this growing rivalry, and yet neither side backed down, and things quickly escalated into what we know as the Cold War. So why did these wartime allies begin to turn against each other in the aftermath of the war? Well, let's consider the situation on all sides as the war came to an end. In the United States, soldiers are returning home victorious. The war had exacted a major toll, but relatively speaking, the casualty toll for the United States was light compared to many other nations. About 300,000 Americans were killed in the war. The Great Depression was over, although anyone who lived through it still remembered it well. It was the wartime production that ended the Great Depression, and that production was being phased out. What would prevent the Depression from returning? There was massive demobilization in the aftermath of the war, wartime industries being phased out. The labor market was unstable. And so the United States needed to ensure that there were world markets that would help to prop up the economy. On the one hand, things like rationing that went on during the war were no longer in place. On the other hand, we needed to establish new industries and new markets that would replace the massive industrial buildup of the war. For the Soviets, they were also returning home victorious, but to a much different situation. Their homeland had been devastated during the war. Some 27 million Russians had been killed. Countless others were maimed. Thousands of square miles of territory were pretty much destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Russians were homeless in the aftermath of the war. Tens of thousands of villages had been leveled. Their lives were essentially in ruins. And so one doesn't have to wonder much why the Russians were perhaps in a grim mood in the aftermath of the war and continuing to look to the rest of the world for assistance. In the rest of Europe, the war had wrought devastation and discontent. Their economies were in ruins. Former global empires were torn apart and being dismantled. Populations were in discontent, and there was the very real possibility of global communism on the rise. So if we put aside for a moment things like the Bolshevik Revolution, the Red Scare after World War I, and the ancient animosities between the United States and the Soviet Union, there were still major challenges in the aftermath of World War II that the United States would have had to overcome. And it's possible that there would have been a Cold War between the two sides even without that ancient history of rivalry. What kind of challenges did the United States face in the aftermath of the war? Well, first and foremost, they needed to restore the vitality of global markets and establish world markets for their goods. Again, the return of the Great Depression was a very real thought on the minds of many policymakers after the war. And so the United States was insistent on spreading capitalism and maintaining an open door and free trade with as much of the globe as they could. And there are some scholars who point to this as one of the major precipitating causes of the Cold War. It was the United States pushing the spread of capitalism around the world, not the Soviets and their efforts to spread communism that primarily contributed to the Cold War. For the Soviets, the primary objective coming out of the war was to secure a buffer zone on their western border to protect against any future attacks. After the war, the Soviets assumed control of about half of Poland. The western border of Poland had been moved to consume a portion of Germany as part of the settlement of the war. Many of those Germans were removed from their homes. Thousands of German women were raped by the Red Army during and after the war. The Soviets exerted a powerful influence over the nations on their western border, like Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and others. Stalin feared encirclement by the Western nations. He also feared disloyalty in his midst. And this was an era of horrific purges. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russians were arrested and even killed during this time as Stalin strengthened his control over the country. In the meantime, the United States contemplated how best to ensure a stable economy in this very unstable world after World War II. One cog in the plan was to secure the market in China. 500 million or so Chinese consumers could certainly lift the United States economy. The problem was that in 1945, China was still in the middle of a civil war that dated back to the 1930s. There, a communist minority struggled under Mao Zedong to overthrow the nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek. The United States sent aid to Chiang, but much of the aid was siphoned off by corrupt members of Chiang's government. The repression and corruption of Chiang's government increasingly alienated the peasants who were drawn to Mao's movement. The United States attempted to weaken Mao by separating him from Moscow, not understanding that the two were already independent of each other. In 1945, for considerable territory in the post-war settlement, Stalin agreed to negotiate with Chiang rather than Mao. Stalin, for his part, and we now know this in the aftermath of the Cold War, hoped merely to continue the chaos in China and not have to worry about a powerful, unified China as his neighbor. Despite these efforts, Mao's movement continued to grow, and Chiang could not solidify his hold on the country. Truman sent aid and even soldiers, numbering eventually as many as 100,000 to support Chiang. With the end of World War II, Mao's troops were strengthened when retreating Japanese forces left huge stocks of weapons and ammunition in Manchuria, which Mao's men were able to seize. The United States was left in a quandary. They either had to virtually completely prop up Chiang and hope that he could prevail, or leave Chiang, knowing that Mao and the communists would prevail. By 1946, America's commitment to Chiang was waning, and it seemed likely that China would fall to communism. Maintaining the open door in China had failed. There were also early Cold War showdowns in Turkey and Iran. During World War II, the Allies had jointly occupied Iran with the understanding that 6 months after the war they would remove their troops. As the deadline approached, Stalin increased the Soviet presence in Iran. British assistance in the region was also declining due to the harsh winter of 1946 and the fact that Britain itself was in the midst of rebuilding after the war. Only strong urging from the United Nations eventually led Stalin to withdraw his forces from Iran, as originally agreed, though the Soviets maintained close economic ties in the region. In Turkey, Stalin hoped to negotiate an agreement to allow the Soviets to establish military bases there. This was an important region, overlooking the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. During this showdown in Turkey, United States Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson advised that the United States confront the Soviets now, before the fall of Turkey led to the fall of the Middle East, then India and China. Even at this early juncture of the Cold War, Acheson was describing a sort of domino theory, which would become critical under Eisenhower and later administrations. The domino theory assumes that the Soviets are driven by expansion and will not stop unless forced to do so. In fact, we now know that wasn't the case. They were more interested again in consolidating and protecting the territory they already controlled. But in 1946 and early 1947, Truman and others weren't interested in disputing the theory. As Truman said, we might as well find out whether the Russians were bent on world conquest now as in 5 or 10 years. The United States responded by escalating its military presence in the Mediterranean, including sending the most powerful aircraft carrier, the Franklin D. Roosevelt, to patrol the region. For the moment, the Soviet presence backed down, but will return to this region numerous times throughout the course as a persistent hotspot throughout the Cold War. In early 1946, the Cold War also escalated into a war of words between the two sides. In a famous speech in February 1946 at the Bolshoi Theater, Stalin announced that capitalism and communism were on a collision course. War was inevitable as long as capitalism existed. In the United States, that speech was interpreted as a declaration of war. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill responded in a speech in Fulton, Missouri on March 5th. This was Harry Truman's hometown, the famous Iron Curtain speech. Churchill declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. All are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow." Churchill also suggested that Europe, outside of the United Nations, form an informal organization to reorder the world. Obviously, the Soviet Union would not be a part of that organization. Stalin decried the speech, comparing Churchill to Hitler, and again suggested that war was near. He called Churchill's speech a call to war with the Soviet Union. The New York Times, in a powerful article in 1946, continued this escalation of the message, writing that since 1940, the Soviets had annexed 13 nations, more than 270,000 square miles of territory, and a population of some 24 million people. The Times wrote, "Where does the search for security end, and where does expansion begin?" The Cold War jockeying was starting to heat up. The Soviet Union continued to distance itself from its former allies. It rejected an offer from the United States for a $1 billion loan, which the United States had extended in late 1944 as the war was still winding to its close. The Soviets could not be bought at that juncture for any price, and chose to avoid the offer, which of course would have come with strings attached. They also refused to become a member of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, again seeing them as attempts by the United States to buy off their independence and control the Soviets. The Soviet Union would go it alone. In the summer of 1946, Stalin announced a new 5-year plan, which included eliminating Western influences and spreading communist dogma. Such things indicated to policymakers in the United States that the Soviet Union was a rising global menace. Also in the summer of 1946, actions in Germany intensified the Cold War, though to us today they might seem minor. In the eastern part of Germany, the Soviets stopped removing machinery and instead began manufacturing there. This signified their resolve and that they had no intention of ever leaving East Germany. From the American side, an American general named Lucius Clay announced that the Soviets would no longer receive reparations from funds generated in the western part of Germany. That region was too close to bankruptcy and needed to preserve its own economy. In effect, each of the superpowers had determined to develop its own zone in Germany. There would be no more negotiation or discussion about Germany between the two sides. The battle of words continued. Secretary of State James F. Burns gave a powerful speech in Stuttgart, Germany on September 6, 1946. In the speech, he suggested that the border of Poland should be pushed back to its original location and the territory restored to Germany. He argued that Germany should be made independent and allowed to supervise its own recovery. He also announced that the American presence in Central Europe would not be withdrawn. This only strengthened the ties between the Polish and Moscow and created alarm in Russia, where it seemed the United States was trying to take Poland away from them. There was also activity in the realm of the atomic bomb in 1946 that further intensified the Cold War. There was much discussion in the United Nations regarding nuclear policy, the sharing of technology, and the like. The United States was uncomfortable because the Soviet Union had veto power in the United Nations and might be able to veto any plan that would oversee the Soviet atomic program. So United States representatives proposed a plan that would involve inspections of nuclear capabilities and limitations on nuclear production that wouldn't be subject to the veto. The Soviets objected, of course, and refused to go along with the plan. So at that time, no plan overseeing nuclear technology was formally adopted by the United Nations. As if to drive home its message, in July 1946, the United States detonated 2 atomic bombs at Bikini Island, sending a clear message to the Soviets and the rest of the world. The first bomb, a traditional bomb like the ones dropped in Japan at the end of the war, is pictured on the right. The second bomb, pictured below, was detonated underwater and unexpectedly created a condensation cloud that made additional tests impossible due to high contamination levels. Residents of the island, while few, had to be relocated, temporarily at first and then permanently. The more infamous and perhaps well-known tests at Bikini Island occurred later. In 1954, a thermonuclear bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb created an enormous cloud that has become one of the more memorable images of the nuclear age and spread nuclear waste around the entire globe, setting off an international incident. For his part, Harry Truman was relatively quiet during those early months of the Cold War. New to the presidency, he chose to observe, learn, and consult with his advisors rather than dive into policy too quickly that might backfire later on. In 1946 and into 1947, Truman was under fire from critics who argued that he was a weak leader and needed to take charge of the situation. His approval ratings, which were sky high after the dropping of the bombs and winning the war, sagged into the mid-1930s. The winter of 1946 was especially harsh in Europe, and starvation and suffering were ubiquitous. There were calls on the liberal side for Truman to do more to aid them. On the other hand, there were many who opposed additional aid to Europe. many of whom Americans recalled were ungrateful after much aid was sent following World War I. There was also a strong trend in the country to look out for ourselves on the home front. Americans had sacrificed at home and abroad during the war, and now many wanted to concentrate on our own well-being, not send millions to Europe. By the fall of 1946, the old New Deal coalition appeared to be crumbling, as many liberals accused Truman of being too militaristic and concentrating too much on foreign policy while not focusing at home. Conservatives claimed exactly the opposite, and Truman sat quietly in the middle. The midterm elections of 1946 were a disaster for Truman. The Republicans gained a solid majority in both houses and included some of the more powerful Republicans of the era, including Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, who we'll talk about much more in future lectures. By the end of 1946, the Liberals had begun to fight back, enunciating a policy that would begin to strengthen the wobbly Truman administration. One of the leading voices in this movement was Reinhold Niebuhr, a highly influential theologian and philosopher. Niebuhr began publishing widely in 1946 and 47 his support of New Deal capitalism. He didn't believe that Americans could put much trust in a world government, and he began to focus on Germany and its economic revival as the key component to the American economy. Still, Niebuhr's philosophy was not an official policy. It was just a set of ideas, which grew more clearly enunciated as 1947 began. The nation still awaited Truman's adaptation of those ideas. In fact, it is to that topic that we will turn in our next lecture, the early policies developed by Truman during the Cold War.